Thank you. Gracias. Good morning. Buenos días. I'm thrilled to see all of you here in our panel organized by the Harvard University Growth Lab. And I'm thrilled to have the best possible panel that we could have put together. So we have to my left Santiago Levy, who I'm sure doesn't need any introduction in this room. But he was, until a few years ago, the vice president of sectors in the Inter-American Development Bank for 10 years. And he was also the deputy minister of finance in Mexico a couple of decades ago. And we have also Valeria from the Instituto Mexicano de Competitividad. She's a thought leader in Mexico about topics that have to do with productivity and competitiveness. And we're really glad to have you. And we have Ernesto Stein, also a good friend and a mentor like Santiago to me, who is the representative of the Inter-American Development Bank here in Mexico. And he's a researcher, an economist who has worked a lot too on productivity and industrial development in many countries in the region and of course now in Mexico. So we're going to talk today about the challenges in the region on competitiveness and productivity. And I want to start by telling you what many people, among them Paul Krugman, said, that productivity is nothing in the short term, but it's everything in the long run. And sometimes when we think about these topics like productivity and competitiveness, they sound like this very weird jargon that we will see in an academic paper. But the truth is that those are the issues that matter the most for everybody in this room, for everybody outside of this room. They define economic growth, they define prosperity. So therefore, we are really looking forward to this important conversation. And I want to start with you, Santiago. By helping us understand a little bit the landscape of this enigma, because as you know, Mexico is a very different country than the US and Canada. And in the 1990s, this process started of integrating the region through the free trade agreement formerly known as NAFTA, now known as the USMCA. But it was a very different country in essence. It was the first time that a developing country will join in a trade agreement with two developed countries. So can you give us, Santiago, a bit of a landscape of what is so different about Mexico in this context, and whether the challenges that you saw then perhaps are still there?
So thank you, Dany, and thank you all, and particularly to North Capital Forum. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and share the stage with good friends, with Valeria, with Ernesto, and with Dany. So a few remarks might be useful to put things in context. I was in government at the time in which NAFTA was being negotiated. And we were keenly aware that this was the first time that an integration and trade agreement was going to be signed between two countries that had very different income per capita, very different productivity levels. The expectation was that the free trade agreement was going to play a major role, not the only, but certainly a major role in helping Mexico close the income per capita gaps vis-a-vis the US and the productivity gaps vis-a-vis the US. 3 decades later, we now have a lot of data, and we can actually see that this was not the case. A few facts might be relevant. If you compare productivity in the United States versus Canada and versus Mexico, in the last 3 decades, productivity in the United States increased. Productivity in Canada increased a little bit less, but still increased. Productivity in Mexico actually decreased. So the productivity gap between Mexico and the partners in NAFTA actually widened after NAFTA rather than narrowed. And the immediate result of that was income per capita differences between Mexico and its partners in the north actually widened after NAFTA than before. It's extremely difficult to ask the counterfactual and say, look, without NAFTA, the productivity gap would have been even larger. And we cannot answer that. But what we do know is that NAFTA did not help to close the productivity gap. So the big question is why? And Dany began by saying, in the short run, productivity is irrelevant. We're all worried about interest rates and the exchange rate. But over 10 years, over 20 years, productivity really is what makes the difference in living standards across countries. So why is it that productivity in Mexico did not increase? And it's kind of a complex story, and I'll try to summarize it in 2-3 minutes. But it goes to the deep point that Dany made. Mexico's institutions were very different from the institutions of Canada and the United States at the time in which these two countries were put together. This is a very different process from the European Union, in which convergence was not only convergence in trade and investment flows, it was also convergence in institutions across a wide range of areas. In the case of NAFTA, what it was convergence in trade flows and in investment flows, but the institutions of countries in other domains, in the regulations of markets, and critically in the regulations of labor markets, would be the same as countries had before. And indeed, the way Mexico regulates its labor market is very, very different from the way Canada and the US regulates its labor market. The upshot of that is that Mexican labor market is segmented into two big, broad areas that, from the perspective of the US and Canada, make no sense. And we use words that for the average Canadian economist or for the average American economist actually are kind of meaningless. But in Mexico, our labor market is segmented into a group of workers that work formally, meaning they are hired by a firm that complies with regulations on labor, on social insurance, and on taxation, and workers that work informally. Surprisingly, you might not know this, almost 60% of the labor force works informally. And even more surprisingly, 90% of all firms in Mexico hire their workers informally. So as opposed to Canada and the US, we have a very different productive structure. We have a small subset of firms that are formal, that are highly productive, that as a result of NAFTA have become even more productive, that have created very good jobs, and that have turned Mexico into an export powerhouse. Another little piece of data, we export more manufactured goods than all of Latin America put together. But that segment of firms coexists with a larger segment of firms that are a lot less productive, that experience a lot less productivity gains, and that actually have pulled the productivity average of Mexico down. So if you think about Mexico, this is a caricature, and there's a continuum, but think of it as a caricature. A caricature is there's a formal segment of the Mexican economy and there's an informal segment of the Mexican economy, and Mexico is an average of the two, is a weighted average of the two. This part of the economy has done extremely well. The other part of the economy has not, but it's larger. And when you take the weighted average of all that, the result is that productivity over the last 3 decades has actually fallen a little bit. It's become negative. So I'm going to stop right here, but the key idea that I want to convey is that integration in trade flows and integration in investment flows might not yield the expected results, and this is an ex-post lesson rather than ex-ante anticipation, if a whole range of other institutions do not imply that markets, and in particular labor markets, are going to play the allocative function and the efficiency function that is expected in traditional models in which integration leads to convergence in income levels and convergence in productivity levels. That didn't happen in Mexico, and that's the big lesson looking ahead. Stop here.
Thank you, Santiago. And I actually want to add that another interesting and important difference between the European integration is labor mobility. We probably won't have a lot of time to talk about that, but that's a big elephant in the room, at least to me, the fact that in North America there's no idea that eventually there's going to be much more labor mobility between countries as part of this institutional arrangement, and that probably also plays a big role in this. But Valeria, I want to ask you the difficult question, if I may, which is that NAFTA is gone, and now we have the USMCA. And there's a whole range of thoughts whether USMCA is different, but maybe not so different. And but in that context, I want to ask you, as somebody who has studied this topic for a while within Mexico, what are really the opportunities from now onwards? And given the context, and in particular, what can Mexico do to make this region more competitiveness? Also in the context of the ideas that Santiago was describing.
Thank you, Dany. What can I say after Santiago spoke? Like, very little. I just want to add a little bit to what Santiago said regarding informality and formality. And you said, Santiago, that maybe for the US and our Canadian partners, they just don't understand our own differences in the labor market. And there's one thing that is key to understanding that difference. In Mexico, informality is not illegal. So it's pretty common. It's pretty usual. We're all used to it. And we have informality even in the government. So you were saying that 90% or something like that hire people informally, not only firms, also the government. So we have a dual labor market, and what we have been doing for the past many years is increasing the costs of the formal sector. So whenever we add a regulation in order to improve the quality of lives of workers, we always tackle the formal sector. For example, this week, it was passed on Congress that Mexican workers should have more days of vacation than what we used to have, which is great. So we passed, instead of having 6, we're going to have 12. And you say, well, this is great, amazing news, because the law hadn't been changed since 1970, so it's great. However, who is going to pay the cost for it? Because that increases the cost for formal firms. So what we are doing, increasingly so, is hiring or taking it up the cost of formality. And then we surprise ourselves of seeing these numbers, like, oh, how can that be that we have a 60% informal market? Well, we're doing everything to increase that cost of formality. So being a formal worker is around 50% more expensive for the firm than hiring people informally. So we are creating the perfect incentives for informality to grow. And you were saying as well that we have some firms, particularly in the center, in the north part of the country, that are incredibly productive, and I do agree with that. I was a couple of, maybe a month ago in Ciudad Juárez, where all the manufacturing firms established many years ago. And I was invited there, and people there told me, well, we need to make firms more productive. And I went and visited some of these firms, and to my surprise, I hadn't ever been there, to my surprise, they were incredibly productive. So it's like, you want to become even more productive, but you are incredibly productive. The way that the firms and the manufacturing plants operate that I had in mind was a completely different reality when I saw it. They were incredibly well-functioning, incredibly productive, and they treated employees incredibly well. And then we see the south of the country, where we have the informality, the real informality problem. Santiago was mentioning these large firms, but bear in mind that 94% of firms in Mexico are micro and small firms. And when I say micro, there are between 0 and 10 employees. So the large chunk of firms in Mexico are really small firms that, of course, they are really informal, and then it becomes kind of a circle. They are small, and they start being informal, and if they grow, they have to become formal. But formality is so expensive, they don't want to become formal. So they stay small in order to avoid IRS and to avoid the Ministry of Finance regulation. So they stay small, and they stay less productive. And that problem, as I always say, it was created by us. It wasn't, like a meteorite that came and said that Mexico will have this kind of labor market. No, we created it. And I think that if we created it, we might be able, in time, to change the reality. However, that will be incredibly complex, because informality now, it's like a medusa. You take off one snake and 10 come out. It's really complicated to change the way informality sector works. And now, going directly to your question, Dany, I'm sorry to take this detour. I know we always talk about the opportunities that USMCA or NAFTA before brought to Mexico, and I do think there are incredible opportunities. I think we have opportunities in the South, and when I say opportunities in the South, I'm not implying that we need to industrialize the South and change completely the face of the South part of the country and turn it into a very industrial area. I think that's not the case. But we forget that the south of Mexico is really close to the United States. We usually transport all the things that we produce, of course, by land, by train in some cases, but we forget, and then when we think about it, the South is really, really far from the US because of by land, of course it is. But we have the Gulf of Mexico. We are really close to the United States. That opportunity is being completely missed. We can use the sea to transport all the goods that we produce. And that would be a great opportunity for the South. Of course, that implies changing some regulations, not only in Mexico, but in the United States. And that adds a little bit of complexity there. In the USMCA, we have a specific chapter on competitiveness. And that chapter was included because Mexico asked for it. Mexico asked that we had a competitiveness clause, a competitiveness article, that included some teamwork and committees so that we could work together with the three economies to foster productivity and competitiveness in the region. What has been done there? Absolutely nothing. And it was a chapter that was included because Mexico asked for it. That committee doesn't work, doesn't exist. So we are missing opportunities that we even asked for. In USMCA, we asked for a corruption chapter. There it is. What are we doing with it? So we included many things in that new treaty that we are not implementing that could foster Mexico's productivity and competitiveness.
Right. And I think the underlying theme here, which I want to make it explicit, is that Mexico has many challenges that until they are resolved, or at least partly resolved, that is keeping the whole region from achieving its full potential in terms of competitiveness. So in that context, I want to go to you, Ernesto, as the person directing all the operations of the Inter-American Development Bank here in the country, because I know you've been focusing quite a lot in this gap between the North and the South, that some of it, as Santiago alluded, it perhaps could be explained that gap even increased as the economy integrated to the North. So what are the type of things that you are looking into to try to take advantage of the context right now to really use those or create those opportunities for the south of Mexico?
Thanks, Dany. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks to the forum. So I was listening to Santiago. He was describing this perhaps caricature of maybe two Mexicos, like a formal Mexico, which in a way is like an industrial powerhouse, and at the same time this larger part of Mexico, which is informal, and so Mexico is the average of the two, and so that's why perhaps we are not converging to the levels of productivity of the US or Canada, etc. And when he was saying this, I was thinking, one can also think of two Mexicos regionally, and Valeria was discussing this. So Mexico is a country with really huge regional differences, and the gap between the North and the South is really very large, and perhaps because the proportion of the modern Mexico, of the formal Mexico, of those companies that are at the cutting edge of technology, not only in terms of manufacturing, we have in the north and in the center of the countries of the country, companies like Intel or Ford that have some of the most important research centers in the respective sectors in the whole world. And yet, like the advantages of belonging to NAFTA and TMEC later on have not trickled down to the South. And that is why we are very much focused at the IDB on the South. So the South, like poverty rates are basically twice as high as those in the North. Productivity is about half. Productive capacities measured as your colleague Ricardo Hausman measures them in terms of complexity are really lacking. So Mexico, in Latin American perspective, is the most complex economy in the world. In Latin America. It's the economy in Latin America by far that has the most productive capacities. But the gap in productive capacities between the North and the South are very significant. And linked to this, the South is much less integrated into the rest of North America and much less integrated into the world, whether you look at this in terms of like exports over GDP or foreign direct investment over GDP, etc. And what's kind of sad is that this gap is not closing. This gap is becoming wider and wider. If you look at the last 25 years, I mean, the North and the Bajío area have had rates of growth that are nothing to write home about, maybe 1.6, 1.9% per year. But the South, the rate of growth has been basically zero. And at the IDB, what we have realized is that if we don't focus specifically on trying to help the South develop, it's not just that we are not going to contribute to reduce the gap, we may be even contributing to expand it. And why do I say this? So right now we are at a moment when Mexico has tremendous opportunities. So because of different events, I mean the pandemic, because of the conflict, trade conflicts between the US and China, because of the war. So companies and countries are trying to reorganize their value chains. They're trying to reorganize their supply chains in order to make them more resilient and in order to make them more agile. And that generates tremendous opportunities for Latin America in general, but Mexico is at a special place to take advantage of these opportunities because of the fact that it shares a border with the US, because of the fact that it belongs to the same trade agreement, because of the fact that it's already engaged in many of the important value chains in terms of auto industry, aerospatial, electronics, etc., and because it has the productive capacities to take advantage. But when we, lately, we've also had the resumption of the diálogo económico de alto nivel between the US and Mexico, and that generates further opportunities. But if we were to ask ourselves from the point of view of the IDB, where are the greatest opportunities for Mexico? They are in the same sectors in which Mexico already is doing well, like in auto industry, electronics, like medical devices, etc. But the problem is that the South doesn't have the capabilities to engage in these sectors, and the South, you need certain industrial processes. Firms have to be capable in terms of machining and plastic injection. There are some things that you need in order to engage in these sectors in which Mexico already has been successfully linked to the value chains of the North, and the South doesn't have these capabilities. So if we were to focus on those sectors that present the greatest opportunities for Mexico as a whole, we might be leaving the South behind. And that's why we thought we need to focus plainly on what are the type of sectors and the type of opportunities that might be there in the South, like, for example, in agribusiness, there are tremendous opportunities. Maybe there are opportunities in manufacturing, in sectors that are like intensive labor intensive, where like salaries already in the north might be too high, etc. And another example, at the IDB Invest, which is the private arm of the IDB, when I arrived in Mexico, they used to tell me, well, a country like Mexico, like a middle-income country like Mexico, our minimum ticket for our projects is $20 or $25 million. And we're going to find a lot of good businesses, good opportunities of $20 or $25 million in the north and in the middle of the country, but there's not that many in the south. So we have to work with those minimum tickets and reduce them in the south if we are going to want to make a difference. So for these reasons, it is that we have decided to focus, not in an exclusive way, but a big part of our attention in the south and southeast states. So one of the things that we did is visit the interoceanic corridor of the Tehuantepec Isthmus, and we did a joint visit with the Secretaría de Hacienda and Crédito Público with the Undersecretary Gabriel Llorio and the authority of the corridor, because we think that's a project of, that really has a chance to make a difference. Like Valeria was saying, there's the port of Coatzacoalcos is very close to like the eastern coast of the United States, the Gulf area of the United States. So we believe that there's like a big opportunity there. It's not easy to, this region is highly lagging in infrastructure as well. And so projects like the corridor, I think have a lot of promise, but there's a lot that needs to be done in order to take advantage of those opportunities. And we are also focusing on other issues in states like Oaxaca, Chiapas, etc. And I can talk more about it as we progress. So.
And I want to do a shameless plug-in too, because I see our friends from UNHCR here, that we are also working together on thinking the opportunities for the south of Mexico, given the flow of immigrants from Central America. And it's a project that we're actually working on together. And next year, we'll present you the results. But let's just do another short round and try to keep it short to open up to the public. But Santiago, you wrote a magnificent book, which I recommend to all of you looking at it and read it. It's called Under Rewarded Efforts, in which you lay out very specifically the reforms that Mexico ideally should go through in order to fix this conundrum of productivity. So I wonder, from those reforms, if you can, I know it's hard, but if you can give us like a short understanding of what are those reforms that are perhaps even realistic, that could really help not only Mexico, but the competitiveness in the region as a whole.
So anything that helps the competitiveness of Mexico will help the competitiveness of North America. If you think about the average wage of North America as a weighted average of the productivities of the region. So clearly, the three countries would gain if Mexico had a much higher productivity. So Dany's question, so what are the obstacles? Unfortunately, it's no one. Whenever people talk about informality or sort of low productivity sector, they always want to point out, oh, it's this, or it's that, or it's this other. It's really a sequence of regulations, and it's impossible to focus on it. That said, three broad areas of work. Valeria mentioned something really important. Valeria said that a significant share of informality in Mexico is legal. A lot of the activity that you see when you walk out of this and you go into the main avenue right here, a lot of the activity that you see of people peddling things in the street is not violating neither the labor law, nor the social security law, not necessarily the tax law. The reason is our Constitution segments, this is very alien to Canada, very alien to the United States, difficult to understand, when you come from the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition. Ours is a Napoleonic legal tradition. So our Constitution, from the start, segment workers depending on the type of labor contract. And the obligations of firms towards their workers depend on the type of labor contract. The sort of things that Valeria was saying, whether you have to pay for their vacations or not. More importantly, whether you have to pay for their social insurance or not. Whether you can fire them or not fire them. All that depends on the labor contract. So obviously firms will adjust labor contracts to try to bypass, not necessarily evade, bypass regulations by structuring themselves in ways that are cost minimizing and profit maximizing, but that are not productivity enhancing. So one big first area of research, policy. We have to rethink the whole structure of social insurance and the structure of social benefits around the status of workers in the labor market. We can no longer attach access to benefits depending on whether the firm gives you a salaried contract or a non-salaried contract. Let me make a caricature that is going to make some of you laugh, but I just don't want to put in the head what you say. Suppose in the United States, Obamacare would have said, all right, everybody living west of the Rocky Mountains will get free health benefits. And everybody living east of the Rocky Mountains will pay for the health benefits. If this was written into the US law, you would say, look, this doesn't make any sense. Why would I want to segment people on this side, free health benefits, and people on this side, people have to pay for the health benefits? Clearly, this is going to induce a lot of reallocation to arbitrage the difference that is not necessarily productivity enhancing. Mutatis mutandis, our law says, if you have a salaried labor contract, you and the firm that hires you must pay for your pension, your health, your disability, et cetera, but if you have a non-salaried labor contract, you don't have to do any of that. No surprise, most contracts in Mexico are not salaried contracts. So first big area of research, of policy change, the structure of social insurance and the structure of labor regulation around the status of workers in the labor market. Second, very big. A lot of the businesses that you see out here are actually paying taxes. We have something in Mexico called special tax regimes. And those tax regimes works as follows. If you're a firm and your sales are under $100,000 a year, your tax rate is 2% of sales. 2% of sales. If you're a firm and you sell $100,001, you no longer qualify for the special regime. You have to pay taxes on the normal corporate regime, and then you pay about 35% of profits. So if you make the calculations, and I've made them, for a very large number of firms, it doesn't make sense to grow. Because if you grow, you go into the other tax regime, and after-tax profits are lower, even if the firm is bigger. So there's a large discontinuity, and that discontinuity generates the sort of behavior that Valeria was making. So second big area of policy change, taxation. One last one, and I'll stop. Many of the firms that you see around here, and actually most firms in Mexico, are not registered as a firm where the assets of the firm are separated from the assets of the owner. We tend to think of firm as an incorporated entity in which the assets of the owner and the assets of the firm are separate, and the assets of the firm can be pledged as collateral to access credit or to do commercial transactions. But you actually incorporate your firm if the legal process and the legal institutions associated with commercial contracts and credit contracts function relatively efficiently. That's not the case in Mexico, and we have a lot of evidence that this is a very, very costly process. So many firms may register with the tax ministry, but will not incorporate separating their assets. That means that they can only have one shareholder. And that means that they cannot issue bonds, nor stocks, nor grow by adding capital and diluting risk by having more shareholders. So there's something deep in the legal structure of Mexico, and in a very kind of perverse way, NAFTA might have made this a little bit worse for the following reason. Large firms exporting or interacting with the US and Canada, or under the umbrella of NAFTA provisions or USMCA provisions, can actually subcontract, so to speak, part of the contractual structure to New York. But medium-sized firms and small-sized firms don't. And for them, the legal structure does not really work very well. So when you add a legal context in which it's costly, transactions costs are costly, and there are little incentives to incorporate as a firm, in which the tax regime is telling you the best thing you should do is be small, and then in which the contractual structure of the firm, depending on the labor market, tells you, look, you shouldn't really have salaried workers, and if you do, you should evade the law. When you put all that together, the name we give to all that complex set of incentives is informality. But that's just a label. What really matters is what's underneath all that, and what's underneath is a reflection of Mexico's social contract. And that is what has not been changed. NAFTA notwithstanding, and USMCA notwithstanding. And that's the deep reason behind productivity stagnation and behind the divergence in income per capita. And that's why it's so complex to actually begin to think about it. I stop here.
Thank you. Mind blowing. I wanna leave some time for Q&A, but let me just do a couple more questions to you too. And actually, I'm gonna go to Ernesto and then go back to Valeria. Because Ernesto, you mentioned something that is very interesting, in which perhaps you were hinting that one of the biggest constraints is access to credit. When you were talking about the small firms not being, the loans were too big for the small firms. But I wonder, in your view, particularly when you're focusing on the South, is there a way that you are prioritizing what are the different types of constraints? Because it seems, from our conversations, infrastructure seems to be a big constraint. Perhaps human capital might be a constraint. So how do you see all these different moving pieces in your strategy?
Well, I think the South...
Wait,
no,
go ahead.
sorry.
No, I do have a difficult question for you. So let me ask that to Ernesto in terms of the IDB, and then I'll come back to you. Sorry, my bad.
Yes, so, I mean, in the South, you have to work on a number of issues at the same time. So let's say that you're a company that wants to invest in the North. You already have the industrial park there. You already have good connectivity to water and electricity. I mean, water might be a problem in the North, but you have the talent, you have the closeness to the United States. In the South, there's a lot of things that you have to do at the same time. Like, for example, within the corridor, the idea is to develop 10 industrial zones, but the industrial parks are not there. You have to attract the industrial parks. You have to attract the companies that are going to set themselves there. You have to develop their suppliers. You have to develop talent in order for this talent to work there. You have to make the cities livable so that talent wants to be there, etc. So there's a lot of things that you have to do at the same time. So at IDB Invest, for example, we can help solve these issues by, we can finance industrial parks, we can finance the anchor companies that are going to go to these industrial parks and become the anchors, and we can also provide credit for their small and medium enterprise suppliers, for example. So you have to deal with coordination problems of all sorts. So you were asking about access to credit more generally. We also, through the public side of the IDB, we have provided like a loan of $200 million to NAFIN in order for that to be extended to small and medium enterprises. But I think sometimes states don't take full advantage of, for example, the things that the national development banks can do. And they are very well funded. Like, for example, there's a program called Impulsa NAFIN más estados, okay? So if the states put a certain amount of money, NAFIN puts like maybe 10 or 20 times, depending on the state, as much money to provide loans at very reasonable rates for small and medium enterprises. And sometimes states don't put a lot of money. If they would put more money into this, they would get more funding from NAFIN to finance small and medium enterprises. FIRA, like the Development Bank for the agriculture sector, which is a very well-run institution, also has a lot of funding. And I think if governments in the South would do more in terms of identifying opportunities, and we are working with FIRA to try to identify opportunities in agribusiness in order to develop value chains, in order to help maybe small producers with some anchor companies, through some anchor companies, to reach international markets, etc. I think there's huge opportunity in the agribusiness sector. So we are working together with FIRA, and we hope to work together with some of the governments in the South in order to identify economic opportunities. We are doing a study on global value chain opportunities in Oaxaca, for example. So we're trying to do a lot to uncover what might be some of these opportunities. Okay. Now, not only so throughout Mexico, we do a lot in order to, for example, expand digital capabilities. But in places like Chiapas and Oaxaca, you have the following problem. If you train people and they develop these capabilities, then there are no companies in Chiapas and Oaxaca that demand these capabilities. And so people have the option of not to take advantage of those newly acquired talent, or to migrate. And so the option typically is to migrate. And there is a lot of talent that is being produced in the universities of Chiapas and Oaxaca, but then they migrate to the north to take advantage of the opportunity. So one of the things we want to do is create remote work hubs in places like Chiapas and Oaxaca, so people can acquire capabilities, and then through, for example, freelancing platforms, or through companies, linking people that acquire these talents with companies that accept remote work. I mean, we're trying to develop these kind of issues so people can acquire talent and stay in their place rather than have to migrate somewhere else.
Great. Valeria, sorry that I think you wanted to say something about that question, but I have also a difficult question for you, which is the elephant in the room next door, which is China. So you can choose whichever question you want. But no, I think this is an important conversation to have, and with this I want to close and open to Q&A. Because there is this idea, especially after COVID, that there is some strategic value on keeping some supply chains within the region, which would mean to some extent that Mexico would have an opportunity, perhaps it exists, perhaps it doesn't, to substitute for some of the goods that currently China is exporting to the US and Canada. And in that sense, there's the US-Mexico Foundation has put forward the idea of ally shoring, of firms in the US really reshoring some of their inputs to a place like Mexico. I want you to understand, given this whole complicated context, what are your thoughts on that? Is that even something reasonable to think about? Is that something that policy can change? What are your reactions to that?
Okay, let me address the China one. And I'm not going to be politically correct. It's not going to be the first time. I'm sorry about that. But for example, when you're going to compete with somebody, I don't know, the World Cup, the Olympics, champions, whatever, you understand, or you try to study and analyze and understand your competitor. If Mexico is going to play against Poland in the World Cup, at least I would think the technical director, is studying the way Poland plays, the players that Poland has, and how we are going to play our game in November. In Mexico, we don't understand China. We don't analyze China. We know it's our competitor, but it's too far away. So we really don't know what China does, the way China prepares its people. We don't get it. We don't get the way that China is conducting their academic programs. We just are not into that. We are always seeing north. We are always trying to visit the US and Canada and try to understand the way they do things. And when we look further from the US and Canada, we look to Europe. We kind of forget about Asia, and we kind of forget about China. I do think there are many opportunities that we could take from the conflict between the US and China. Where are those opportunities? I won't be able to say, because we don't understand the way China works. In order to compete successfully with China, we would need to understand it. We would need to know how people are being prepared for jobs, prepared for college, prepared for university. We would have to send people to China, understand the way they are doing things, and we're not doing that. So the opportunity that we have now, I think it's a golden opportunity. I think the door is open, but I don't think we're ready to take it. Maybe some parts of the country are. Maybe some specific sectors are. Maybe some areas in the north or some industries in the center of the country are ready to tackle those. But as a whole, as a country, I don't think we're doing what we need. In China, for example, every student that finishes high school knows how to program. Some are great programmers, some are not that great, but every student knows how to program. We, in college, we don't teach programming at all. So very few people in Mexico know how to program, very few. So how are we going to compete if we are completely unaware of how things are being done? I do think there are some areas of opportunity, some areas that are taking advantage of the opportunity, but not as a whole, not as a country.
Great. No, that's spot on. I appreciate the honesty. So we have 10 minutes, and I do want to open it up for questions. So I think we're just going to take a few questions at the same time and then answer them. So I see a hand back there. If there's some microphones, and I see a hand here and here. I don't know if the microphones are going to where they should go.
Pensé, pero no tenemos ningún centro de México, estudios México-China, ¿verdad?
There's a question down. Well, let's start there with go ahead. Let's take a bunch of them together, but I have you, yeah. Try to make, please, the question very short with a question mark at the end, please.
Sure. Thank you very much. This was splendid. My question is, the informal sector also votes, right? And when 60% of the employment and arguably the population is on the informal sector, they will most likely vote for governments who in turn favor the informal sector. So what to do to get out of this trap?
Okay. We have down there, please, do we have another microphone, or we only have one so that we can pass it around? Thank you.
Good morning. Generally speaking, output and productivity are a function of labor, capital, but with an important multiplier of technology. What role do you think technology, or a lack thereof, plays in this discrepancy of output between Mexico and the northern countries?
Yes. I think Adrian behind you also had a question, right? No? Okay. So we had a question here and here in the front. That's what I can see. There's one here.
Yes, good morning. My name is Gustavo de la Fuente from the San Diego-Tijuana Smart Border Coalition. So this is a question addressed to Mr. Levy. You talked about the social contract and the need for that potentially to change. So if you had a crystal ball, you're looking in 2048 now or 2050, what do we look like? Will Mexico be able to reduce that income disparity and increase that productivity that we didn't get in the last 30 years?
Okay, and I think we have one here, and then we're going to try to do a round to very good questions. We're probably not going to be able to answer them in full, but we're going to give a chance.
Good morning. Thank you for a great panel. Jorge Rabe, I'm the head of the Canadian Export Bank here in Mexico. Energy and the fact that we have energy is a huge part of productivity, and especially clean energy. We're seeing more and more, and my colleagues from Invest in Canada can attest to that, more interest from actually Mexican companies as well to go to Canada and set shop in Canada and start producing out of Canada, not necessarily Mexico. So I wonder if you can speak about the role that Canada is going to play for clean energy and for productivity in the years to come. Thank you.
All right, so we have about 4 questions. One of them is the political economy of informality that I'm not going to take. One of them is about technology and the role of technology. One of them is for Santiago on how Mexico will look like in 20, 30 years from now. And the last one on energy that maybe we'll bunch it together with technology. So why don't we start with you, that you were called out.
Okay, so thank you for the questions. I'll take a couple, and the more difficult ones will be Valeria and Ernesto. So the question back there on, basically the question is, when you segment the labor market and you segment tax obligations and you sort of segment society, you generate a different political economy and different political dynamics. And that political economy can actually be very perverse. Because if I am somewhat in the informal sector, if services in the formal sector are not so good, if the Social Security Institute does not deliver high quality health services, if my pension is not going to be so great, if I'm actually not participating in these institutions, it's really not much of my problem. So the political push to actually fix those institutions is a lot weaker than it is in countries in which those institutions cover everybody. Example, take England and take the NHS, the National Health Service. Probably difficult to think of a more important social institution in England than the National Health Service. But it's universal and everybody participates. So the political dynamics associated with the National Health Service are pretty clear. All governments are interested in improving services because that is clearly a political demand of all citizens. But if you have health services provided by various institutions, some of which you don't participate in, if the quality here is not so good, or the performance is not so good, or if there's corruption, or the rules are not well made, the political push to actually change that is a lot weaker than it was. Another example for people not familiar with the NHS, think of the American Social Security system. Every single American earning income pays into the Social Security system, and the political dynamics of the Social Security system are very complex because everybody has a stake on them. But if only 40% of Americans contributed to the Social Security system, the 60% of Americans who are not contributing, actually for them, whether they reform this or that, it's really not much to their stakes. So I conclude, you segment the electorate, and this actually makes reform even more complex than in situations in which institutions are more kind of universal. On the question over here, extremely difficult question. I hope I'll be around to see. I'm not sure, but maybe I will. You said 2048? You put the bar a little bit too far. But anyway. it should be a more social democratic country. It should look like a little bit like Spain after the entry of Spain into the common market. The institutions should be a lot more universal. This implies politically difficult, ideologically difficult in Mexico, substantive reforms of large provisions of the Constitution, actually to improve them, but that is difficult because by historic, our ideology and all that is very much attached to things that were very relevant at the beginning of the 20th century, but basically not functional in the 21st century. Keynes always said that the most difficult thing to change are not interests. The more difficult things to change are ideas. And maybe a new generation of people will actually see that the ideas that dominate the public discourse today are actually dysfunctional, and that if we would take a much more pragmatic attitude, we could create new institutions that would be more inclusive, more social democratic, and that would actually be a win-win. I'll stop with this. It is easy to construct a win-win in Mexico. The central issue is more of an ideology than the political economy, actually. And the reason it is easy to construct a win-win in Mexico is because the current equilibrium is so profoundly inefficient. And if you change it, it'd be relatively easy in a context in which productivity is growing and income per capita is growing to make everybody better off relatively well. Stop there.
So they're going to kick us out of here in a couple of minutes, but there's a question on technology and a question on energy, and I don't know, you can feel free to chime in.
Very quickly in the technology and the energy questions. I'm going to mix them both. We see technology as a thing of the future, not a thing of the present. And if we continue doing that, we will never catch up with technology. If we always think, well, it's in the future, the next generation, something that is going to happen, we will just not be ready for it. And in order to take advantage of technology, we need energy. And we are doing every possible thing to make energy become a hindrance for Mexico's development. And in that regard, it was completely uncalled for. It was completely unnecessary. There were so many areas that we would have needed an intervention, but not in the energy sector in the way that we did it. So I think by doing things regarding regulation, legislation, public policy, we are creating a very important hindrance for Mexico's development in the next, I'm not talking about the future, I'm talking about the following months, the following year. We're complicated the scenario for Mexico to take advantage of the technology possibilities that we have.
Ernesto, you have the last word.
Yes, I don't have much to say about the questions that were posed, but I want to tackle something that you were discussing with Valeria about China and Asia in general and the opportunities of nearshoring, etc. So I think there's a huge opportunity. So companies used to try to source from the cheapest supplier, and the cheapest supplier many times is in Asia or was in Asia. But lately we've had shortages in vaccines, in semiconductors. We've had increases in transportation costs, in part linked to the war maybe, but also linked to the shortage of containers, etc. So not necessarily now the focus is on the cheapest supplier, but you want to pay attention to agility and resilience. And in that regard, like having productive capacities closer to home, I think is a big advantage and poses enormous opportunities for Mexico. But I think China and Asia in general also pose an opportunity as a market. And we are not discussing that enough. And in particular, in the South, so we've just finished a report on agribusiness, on how to compete in agribusiness and what are the strategies of the companies and what are the public goods that the state has to put in place in order to make success of the private sector policy possible. And in other countries, they're very focused on how do we sell to China cherries and different fruits and vegetables and meats, etc., and how do we sell to Asia. I think in the south of Mexico, there's huge opportunity on that front as well.
Thank you. Well, let me thank the panelists and all of you for being here. This was a fantastic conversation. And the music is sounding, so we're going to get off the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating panel. We needed like 4 hours with all of you. Thank you. So now I will invite you, let's go to Cancillería, all of us. Please remember, you need your badge.